The second time it happened, Calder Pruitt did not call anyone. He stood at the kitchen window, with the coffee going cold in his hand, and watched the line of the back fence the way a man watches a road he knows is about to flood. He had already decided. He just had not said it yet. And he would not say it until morning, because the words would wake his wife. And he wanted her to have one more night of believing the place was theirs. The land had been in the family since his grandfather cleared the lower 40 with a borrowed team and a grudge. 320 acres of bottom pasture and rising timber in the hill country where the creek cut a slow brown channel between two ridges. Calder ran cattle on the open ground and left the timber alone except for the firewood he took each fall. He was 46 years old that autumn, broad through the shoulders, slow to speak, and known across 3 counties as a man who would tell you the truth about a sick cow, even when the truth cost him a sale. People trusted his eye. He could look at a calf and tell you its weight inside 10 pounds. He could read a hoofprint in dried mud and tell you whether the animal had been walking or running and how long ago it passed. That eye was the thing that ruined him in the end. A man who sees less can talk himself out of more. He had spent his whole life on that ground. And he knew its sounds the way he knew the give of his own porch steps. The whippoorwills in the wet months, the bawl of cattle at the gate near dusk, the creek loud after rain and low and chuckling in the dry weeks. He knew where the deer crossed and where the turkeys roosted and which fenceland the coyotes worked when the moon was thin. He did not spook. He had pulled dead calves from the mud at 3 a.m. in February, and driven home with frost in his beard, and not once invented a reason to be afraid of the dark. So when the dogs went quiet, that first September night, he noticed it the way another man might notice a clock that had stopped. He had 2 of them. A blue heeler named Tick, who slept under the porch, and a yellow farm dog named Biscuit, who slept wherever she pleased. Both of them earned their feed by raising hell at anything that moved past the yard after dark. Possums, raccoons, the neighbor's loose hound, headlights on the county road a quarter-mile off. They barked at weather. They barked at nothing. That was the job, and they did it without being asked. Not a sound. The absence of sound. He lay in the dark and listened the way you listen for a baby's breathing. And he heard the house tick and settle. And he heard his wife breathe beside him. And beyond that, no insects, no creek. The creek did not stop. The creek had never stopped in his life. He got up without turning on a light. He had learned long ago that a light at the window lines you to everything past the glass. The floor was cold under his feet, and he found the cold welcome, because it kept him sharp. He moved through the dark house the way he could have moved through it blind, past the table where his hand knew the worn place in the wood, past the stove still ticking with the day's heat, to the kitchen window with its view of the yard and the gate and the long black line of the trees. The moon was 3/4 full and laid a pale shine over the grass, and the dew was already down, so the whole yard held a faint silver to it. And at the edge of that shine, where the yard gave way to the black wall of the timber, the 2 dogs were standing. They were not barking. They were pressed flat to the ground with their bellies in the grass and their faces pointed at the trees, and they were shaking. He could see Biscuit's pale shape trembling from 40 feet away. Tick had his ears down so flat against his skull that his head looked wrong, looked skinned. Neither dog moved. Neither dog made a sound. They held that position the way a man holds his breath at the top of a fall, and they stared at something in the tree line that Calder could not see. He looked where they looked. He saw the timber and the moon edge and the dark between the trunks. He saw nothing. He stood there a long time, and the dogs did not break, and the creek did not start again. And finally, when the cold of the floor had worked all the way up through his feet, he went back to bed without solving it. In the morning, the dogs were themselves again, and the creek ran, and the whole thing folded down into the size of a strange night, and he let it. That was the part he would come back to later. The pattern started small, the way most bad things do. A week after the quiet night, he came down to the lower pasture at first light with a sack of cake to scatter. The way he did most cold mornings, and the cattle were not spread across the bottom where they should have been. And they were bunched in the far corner, all 40 head crowded into a knot against the fence, with their hindquarters jammed to the wire and their heads up and out, the way cattle stand when there is something in the field with them that they have not stopped watching. A cow with a knot like that does not graze. She does not chew. She stands with her nostrils working and her ears swiveled forward, and she waits. Calder had seen cattle bunch for a storm, and bunch for a strange dog, and bunch for the smell of blood, and this was none of those. This was the deep, dumb terror of a prey animal that has spent the whole night being hunted, and is not yet decided. The hunt is over. He counted them twice from the gate, all present. He walked in among them slow with a cake sack, and they would not break to follow it, which was a thing he had never once seen. 40 head of cattle that would walk through a fence for range cake, standing fast in their corner and letting the feed lie. He checked them over as best he could in the gray light. None hurt, no blood, no torn hide, no cow favoring a leg. They would not graze that morning all the same, not until the sun was well up over the ridge, and it burned the frost off the grass, and even then they drifted out of that corner slow and kept drifting toward the house, away from the timber. When he walked the fence in, he found nothing that explained it. No gap in the wire, no hair caught on a barb, no track he could read in the hard ground of the upper field. He told himself coyotes. He had a whole shelf of explanations, and he reached for the nearest one. Coyotes will run a pasture at night and bunch the cattle, and a man would not always find the tracks if the ground was hard. It fit. It almost fit. The only thing it did not account for was the silence of his dogs, who would have lost their minds over a coyote in a field and who had instead lain flat and shaking and quiet. He set that part aside. A man can carry a contradiction a long way if he does not look at it directly. The deer came next. He found the sign 3 mornings later along the creek, where the soft mud below the crossing held a print like wet plaster. He had read that crossing his whole life. The deer came down out of the timber there every evening to water. A trail worn a hand's depth into the bank over generations. The dirt packed hard down the middle and soft at the edges, and the prints had always run in both directions like a busy road, down to drink at dusk and back up to bed in the dark. He could have told you the size of the herd that used it by the spread of the tracks, except now the tracks did not cross. They came down out of the trees, the way they always had 4 or 5 animals, and then 20 yards short of the water they stopped. Not the trail stopped. The animals stopped. The sign showed them coming down at a walk, the prints even and spaced, and then it showed the walk break, the prints crowding and overlapping where the lead deer had balked, and then a hard scatter of churned mud where the whole group had wheeled as one and bolted back up into the timber, the dirt thrown back in clods behind their hooves. Whatever they had smelled or seen or felt at the water, they would not pass it. They had given up the creek. They and their mothers and their mothers' mothers had drunk from for 100 years, and they had given it up at a dead run. He crouched at that churned mud for a long while with his forearms on his knees. A man who reads sign for a living does not enjoy sign. He cannot read, and this sign he could read perfectly, and it told him a thing he did not want to know. The deer had run from the water. The cattle had bunched in the corner. The dogs had gone flat in the grass and stayed quiet. 3 separate animals. 3 kinds of animal, none of which spooked at the same things, all of them refusing the same ground on the same nights. And his mind kept trying to thread the 3 of them onto a coyote or a big cat, which was that he had lived here 46 years and nothing he knew did this. Then he found the print, and the coyote went out of his head for good. It was on the soft ground above the creek crossing, set apart from the deer scatter, pressed deep into the mud where the bank stayed wet. He almost stepped in it. He stopped with his boot in the air and looked down, and the bottom dropped out of the morning. The print was longer than his own boot, and his boot was a 13. It was not a bear. And he knew bear sign, the broad pad and the 5 claw points spread wide. This was narrow where a bear is broad. It showed a heel and a long arch and what read like toes, 4 of them, and then a 5th set off to the side. And the depth of it in that mud meant weight, real weight, more than a man. He stood over it, and he did not breathe for a moment, and then he made himself do the thing he always did, the thing that had kept him steady his whole life. He measured it. He went to the truck and got the tape, and came back and laid it alongside. And the print ran 15 inches heel to toe. He measured the width across the toes at 6 inches. He measured the depth at the heel against the depth of his own boot pressed beside it, and his boot left a 1/4 inch in that mud, with his full weight behind it, and the print beside it had sunk 1.5 inches. He wrote the numbers on the back of a feed receipt with a carpenter pencil because writing the numbers was what a man did with a fact, and he stood and looked at the single print, just the one, with no second print before it or after it, that he could find, as if the thing had stepped down out of nothing, and he felt the first cold thing move through him that he could not talk himself out of. He did not show his wife. He told himself he did not want to worry her, and that was half of it. The other half was that he did not yet have words for it that would not sound like a man losing his grip, and Calder Pruitt had spent 46 years being the man whose grip you could count on. He called the county that afternoon from the phone in the kitchen, the feed receipt with the numbers laid flat on the counter in front of him so he would read them right. A bear, he said, or something big, taking an interest in his cattle, and he gave them the measurement off the receipt, 15 inches, 1.5 inches deep in wet mud. The woman who took the call was kind and bored. He could hear her writing. The slow scratch of someone filling a form they had filled 1,000 times. She asked his name and his road and whether he had lost any stock, and when he said no, not yet, he heard the small shift in her voice, the downgrading, the way a thing with no dead animal attached to it slid down the list. She would log it, she said. An officer might come out when one was free. There had been a lot of calls. He thanked her and hung up and stood with his hand still on the phone, and understood, in the flat way he understood weather, that no one was coming. The land was an hour of bad road from the county seat, and a single print in the mud was not a thing that moved a county to action. He was on his own with it. He had always been on his own out here, and he had always taken a quiet pride in it, in needing no one, in being the man others called instead of the man who called. It had never felt like a verdict before, and it did now. The nights got worse in a way that was hard to point at. The dogs would not sleep outside anymore. They scratched at the door after dark, a frantic scrabbling that started the moment the light failed. And, when he let them in, they did not settle by the stove, the way a dog does. They went to the far corner of the kitchen, the corner farthest from every window, and lay pressed together and watched the glass with their lips tight over their teeth. Tick, who had treed bobcats and once stood his ground against a boar hog, with a tusk laid open along his flank, would not go past the porch steps after the sun went down, and when Calder tried once to walk him out toward the barn on a lead, the dog set all 4 feet and shook. Biscuit had stopped eating her full ration. She left feed in the bowl, which she had never done, and she had gone gaunt across the hips in a week. Calder watched his 2 dogs come apart in front of him, watched the working animals he had raised and trusted unmake themselves into something that only wanted a wall at its back, and he started keeping the rifle by the back door. Not because he had decided anything, because the rifle by the door let him stand in his own kitchen and pretend he had a plan. He saw the eyes for the first time on a Thursday near the end of September. He had gone out at the dog's insistence. Both of them at the door at once, and frantic about it, a low whining that was worse than barking because it was the sound of an animal trying not to be heard. He took the rifle and the big spotlight off the truck, and he went out onto the porch and swept the light along the tree line the way he had 100 times for coyotes. The beam ran flat and white across the grass and up to the wall of the timber, and there at the edge, where the light gave out, 2 points of amber flared and held. He had seen eyes shine his whole life. Deer green, coon yellow, the flat shine of a cat. He knew the height of every animal that carried eyes in his country, knew it the way you know the height of a doorknob by 1,000 unconscious passings. Deer eyes sat at a certain level. Cattle higher. A man's eyes at the height of a man. These were higher than that. The 2 points of amber hung in the dark at a height he kept trying to assign to something on its hind legs. A bear reared up, and the assignment would not hold, because the eyes were too far apart and too still. A frightened animal's eyes move. They blink, they shift, they drop. These did not blink, they did not shift. They sat in the black above where any eyes should be. And they watched the man on the porch with the patience of something that had all night. He held the light on them, and they held on him, and neither gave. He was not a man who frightened easy, and he stood his ground because standing his ground was the only thing he knew how to do. But the cold came up through him again, stronger now, and he understood something his body had known before. His mind agreed to it. He was not the one doing the looking. He had brought the light out to see, and instead he had lit himself up on his own porch for a thing in the trees that had been watching him in the dark just fine without it. The eyes dropped. Not the blink drop of an animal looking away. They lowered smoothly, the way a man's eyes lower when he crouches, and then they were gone, and the timber gave back nothing, and the dogs behind the door had gone completely silent. Calder stood on the porch with the rifle he had not raised, and the light still burning, and he did not move for a long time. Then he went inside and locked a door. He had never once locked in his life, and he sat in the kitchen until dawn with the rifle across his knees. And dawn came up gray and ordinary over the ridge and proved nothing at all. He told his wife some of it the next morning. Not all. He told her there was a big animal working the place, maybe a bear come down out of the hills hungry, and that he wanted her and the kids close to the house after dark for a while. Her name was Rena, and she had married a steady man 20 years before. And she had learned to read the things he did not say. She looked at his face over the coffee, and she did not argue, and she did not ask the questions. He could see her deciding not to ask. She just said, "All right," and moved the children's chores to the daylight hours, and started keeping the big knife on the counter near the sink where her hand could find it. That was the thing about Rena. She did not need the whole truth to act on it. They had 3 children then. The oldest was a boy of 12, Wade, already shaped like his father, and already too brave for his own good. The middle girl was 9. The baby was not quite 2, a late and unexpected gift. A girl they called Posy, who slept in a crib in the room off the kitchen, because it was the warmest room in the house. He stood in the doorway of that warm small room at night and looked at the crib, and then at the window above it, the low window that looked out on the side yard and the dark beyond, and he hung a feed sack over that window with roofing nails and told Rena. She let him have the lie. They both heard it land. October came in cold and wet. The rain helped him in one way and hurt him in another. It held tracks. It also brought the thing closer, or maybe only made him able to see how close it had been all along. He found prints in the mud of the side yard one morning. 2 of them this time, set one ahead of the other along the line of the house, under the windows, the same 15-inch length, the same 1.5-inch depth, walking along his house. In the night, while his family slept, he found where it had stopped under the baby's window, the feed-sacked window, where the 2 prints sat side by side and deeper, as if the weight had settled there and stayed a while facing the wall, facing the place where the crib stood on the other side of the boards. He did not measure those. He stood over them in the gray light with the rain coming down, and he found that his hands were not steady enough to hold the tape, and he had never in his life had unsteady hands. He went inside, and he did not tell Rena about the prints under the window. He took the rifle out of the corner and he cleaned it at the kitchen table, though it did not need cleaning. And Rena watched him do it and did not ask. And the children ate their breakfast in a quiet they did not understand the source of, but had caught from their parents the way you catch a chill. He started sitting up at night. After that, he would put the family to bed, hear the house go quiet, room by room, the children's voices fading, and then Rena's lamp clicking off. And then he would take a kitchen chair into the warm room and set it between the crib and the feed-sacked window. He did not sleep. He learned the night sounds of his own house from the inside, the furnace kicking on and shuttering off, the settle of old beams in the cold, the small wet breathing of the baby in the crib at his elbow. He listened past all of it for the one sound he was waiting for. He got to where he could place every ordinary noise the house made, and set it aside the instant he heard it, the way you learn to sleep through a train and wake at a footstep. For 2 weeks, the sound he was waiting for did not come. And the not coming was its own kind of torment, because he could feel that it was out there, that the choosing not to come was a thing being done to him on purpose, that whatever stood in the timber was content to let him sit in that chair night after night and wear himself thin against a door it had not yet decided to open. A man can stand a siege. It is the waiting before the siege that takes him apart. His neighbor to the north was an old man named Easton, who had farmed the adjoining section for 50 years and buried a wife and most of his friends, and had no use for talk. Calder drove over one afternoon under the excuse of returning a borrowed chain. The 2 of them stood by Easton's barn in the cold and talked about cattle prices and the rain and the road, and then Calder said, careful that he'd had something heavy moving on his place at night. He did not say more than that. He watched the old man's face. Easton was quiet a while. He worked a piece of bark off the chain with his thumbnail, and looked off toward his own machine shed and the ridge rising dark behind it. Then he said his own dogs had been off for a month. Wouldn't go past the machine shed after dark, wouldn't take a bone out there, sat at the door and whined to come in. He said it flat, the way you report a fact you have already made your peace. With Calder asked him, careful, if he'd had anything moving on his place. The old man did not answer that directly. He said he'd lost the habit years back of cutting firewood up in the high timber along the ridge, and when Calder asked why, Easton looked at him with eyes gone pale and flat with age, and said he didn't go up there any more, and he didn't have a good reason that would satisfy a younger man, and he wasn't going to try to give one. He said, "You leave some country to itself." He let that sit. Then he said the thing Calder carried home, and could not put down. He said his own grandfather had moved their home place, once the original cabin, down off the ridge, shoulder to the bottom where it sat, now hauled it log by log with a team and reset it a quarter-mile lower, and never would say why, only that the high ground hadn't wanted them, and a man was a fool to argue with ground that didn't want him. The old man said it the way he'd say the creek was up. No weight on it, no fear in it, just a thing that was true about the country, and always had been. Then he picked up the chain and looked at Calder once more, and Calder thought the old man might say something else, might give him some word that would help, but Easton only said, "Take care of that family," and turned and walked into his barn, and the conversation was over. Calder drove home in the early dark with the old man's word sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone. He had wanted Easton to laugh at him. He had wanted to be told it was bears and foolishness. Instead, he had been handed a thing older than his own grandfather's clearing, a knowledge held quiet by quiet men for longer than the fences had stood, and it did not comfort him to learn. He was not the first. It told him this had a history, and that the men before him, men as steady as he was, had not solved it either. They had only moved. The second sighting came on the first hard frost of November, and it was the one that ended it. He was in the chair in the warm room, the rifle across his knees, the baby asleep, the house dead quiet, and it was somewhere past 2 in the morning when he heard the sound for the first time at full strength. He had heard pieces of it before, he realized later, scraps carried on the wind that he had filed away, as the creek or the furnace or a far-off cow. This was none of those. It came from close, from just past the wall, and it was a layered thing, a low bass rumble that he felt in the chair more than heard, and riding on top of that rumble a second sound, higher, a chattering vibration, like teeth working, like two voices coming out of one throat at the same time. It was not a growl any animal he knew could make. It did not rise and fall like a warning. It just held low and doubled impatient, and it was coming from directly outside the feed-sacked window, 8 feet from the crib, at a height that put the source of it well above a man's head. He did not freeze. Something in him that was older than fear took the controls, and he was up and out of the chair with the rifle in his hands, and he had a thought, clean and cold and complete, that if it came through that wall, he would put the children behind him and Rena behind them, and he would empty the rifle, and it would not be enough. He crossed to the window, and he took the bottom of the feed sack, and he pulled it up an inch to look out. And that was the second time, and that was when he saw enough of it to stop being a man who could stay. The frost had laid a white shine over everything, and the moon was down. But the sky held that faint frost light that comes off snow before the snow, and against it, filling the window, was the lower part of something standing close enough to touch the glass if it reached. He saw a chest. He saw the place where a chest became a shoulder, and the shoulder turned, and he understood he was looking at the side of it, that it had been facing the wall and was turning away. And the chest was covered in hair matted dark, and wet with frost, and under the hair the shape of it was wrong, too long in the trunk, too deep through the body. The proportions of nothing that belonged on 4 legs, and nothing that belonged on 2. He saw an arm, or the thing that an arm would be, longer than an arm, and at the end of it, a hand that was not a paw, dark and articulated, the fingers too long, hanging at a height level with his own face, though the ground outside was a foot lower than the floor he stood on. He saw the muscle move under the hair as it turned. He saw for one instant as it came around, the underside of a jaw, and the wet shine of a single amber eye catching the frost light, and the eye found him through the inch of gap and held him. And there was nothing in it that he could name, and nothing in it that was looking for understanding, only a flat and total attention, the attention of a thing deciding. And then it finished its turn, and it was facing the timber, and it took a step, and the frost crunched under a weight that he felt through the floorboards, and it walked, upright, unhurried. 3 more steps, and it was at the tree line. He let the sack fall. He stood in the warm room with the baby breathing behind him, and he found that he was not shaking, and that the not shaking was worse, because it meant some part of him had moved past fear into the cold, flat place where you simply know a thing and act on it. He did not sit back down in the chair. He stood at the window until the frost light turned to gray, and the gray turned to a low, cold sun. And somewhere in those hours, he stopped being a man who would protect his family on that land, and became a man who would take his family off it. It felt like the ground itself telling him, the way it had told Easton's grandfather, that he and his were not wanted up here, and a man was a fool to argue with it. He told Rena at the kitchen